Hey there folks, Rel here. Today I'd like to share something a lot of players, especially new players, struggle with. We'll be going over how to manage your recoil and not only manage it, but also use it to your advantage. So first I would like to define a couple of things. When I'm talking about recoil, I'm talking about where the crosshair is moving after each shot is fired. So some guns recoil straight up with a little bit of deviations left and right, and some guns will move only straight up and then to the right, or straight up and then to the left. I'll also be making some brief mentions to your cone of fire, and the cone of fire is the area in which your bullets will possibly travel to, in relation to where your crosshair is. In other words, if I'm aiming at something, my bullets are not always going to go where I aim. We're not using lasers. They may go a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, etc., and your cone of fire is reflected by how much space you have within your crosshairs. And obviously when you aim down sights, your weapon becomes much more accurate, so your cone of fire is actually decreasing. The cone of fire is not stagnant. If you move or if you fire repeatedly or jump, the cone of fire is going to bloom out or get bigger. The third thing I'd like to mention briefly is center speed or recentering. That's simply after you fire off a shot, your crosshair is going to recenter. Now you see this in any and every non-arena shooter that I can think of. Now I'm not referring to the automatic recoil compensation which PlanetSide 2 uses, and for those of you who don't know what that is, just don't worry about it. It's a nonsensical mechanic that I could talk about for a minute or two, but in the end it doesn't really affect anything in live fire situations, so just pretend I didn't say anything. I like to think of recoil compensation in two different ways, both serving the same goal of helping you get more bullets on target. I refer to them as recoil compensation and recoil advantage. Now we know weapons recoil in certain directions, and each weapon will function a little bit differently. So the first thing you want to understand is your weapon's recoil pattern. And there are maybe three main elements to a pattern that we actually care about. You will want to know which direction your weapon moves, how long you can sustain fire before it becomes inaccurate, and how much kick takes place after the first shot. In PlanetSide 2, every weapon has what's called a first shot recoil multiplier. For some weapons, namely the faster firing ones, this is inconsequential and can mostly be ignored, but what it means is that your very first shot is going to recoil more than your subsequent shots. Now this is especially important for slow firing weapons and anyone trying to fight from long distances. Figuring out which direction your weapon moves is easy enough. Just look at a wall, aim down sights, and then hold down the trigger. If my weapon moves up and to the right, then I need to practice dragging my mouse down and to the left to compensate. Now a lot of us do this to a certain degree, but if you really practice and make an active effort to pay attention to it while in live fire situations, you'll notice yourself landing more shots on target. So again, if the weapon mostly moves up and to the right, then you want to drag down and to the left. If the weapon moves up and to the left, you obviously want to drag down and to the right. And if the weapon moves straight up, then you just drag straight down. And usually the horizontal deviation is just going to be there regardless, which is why a forward grip is very important on weapons that do that. Knowing how long you can fire a weapon without becoming inaccurate is important because you want to know how often you have to burst. And bursting just means that you're firing in groups instead of just holding down the trigger. So you're firing off 3 or 4 shots before letting that cone of fire shrink back down. The further you are away from your target, the more you'll need to burst because your cone of fire will quickly become too big to land shots unless you get lucky. And lastly, the first shot recoil multiplier. You want to know about how far off your second bullet is going to be from your first. So the easiest way to figure this out is to aim down sights and just fire off 2 or 3 shots. Then you look at how far away the other bullets are from your first shot. I should probably mention that if you have a burst fire weapon or a semi-automatic weapon, or if your weapon can go to burst fire and single fire modes, you have to deal with the first shot recoil multiplier every single time you pull that trigger. And this is a big underlying reason why burst weapons and battle rifles are in such sorry shape. It makes accurate follow-up shots very, very difficult, thus limiting their usefulness to medium ranges when they technically should be more accurate over the longer distances. And here's a quick comparison of that because it's something that I really hate. You'll notice that single firing the NS11A won't even let me empty the magazine before I leave the top of the board. Yet I can empty an entire magazine if I do the same thing while in automatic mode. And it's the same thing here with the T1 Cycler S while using burst fire mode versus automatic fire. So the first shot recoil multiplier is important for a couple of reasons. The first is that at long distances, if you put your crosshair directly on someone's head, the first shot may in fact be a headshot, but you're not going to easily land follow-up shots because you'll be firing over their head, unless you let the weapon recenter. To stress the point again, the first shot recoil multiplier is only really concerning on slow firing weapons, because if you have a fast firing weapon, your first shot recoil multiplier is usually pretty low and you can quickly compensate for the additional error. So this is how we're going to counter this. If you have a high recoil multiplier, you want to aim a little bit lower with your first shot, and this is going to vary depending on the range at which you're fighting. As you can see here, I'm fighting a lot farther away than I should be with this weapon, and I can't zoom in either. And this is the flare, in case you're curious. So to hit someone while I'm holding down the trigger, which I really shouldn't be doing in the first place, is I'm aiming down and below, so that my subsequent groupings will be, in the general vicinity of the target. Now, using recoil to our advantage comes mainly in the form of headshots. If we know that our gun is going to kick straight up after firing, say in close quarters, you don't want to compensate for the recoil. You're in fact using the recoil to kick the gun up into the enemy's head. Of course, once you get around head height, you can start using the recoil compensation techniques, but understanding and using that recoil to your advantage is something that was very beneficial for me to learn, not specifically for PlanetSide 2, but for other games that utilize recoil a lot more as well, and have a greater impact for headshots. And that's where the two main differences actually are. Generally speaking, at close quarters, start at the chest and let the gun kick upwards. This of course depends on the gun, but at medium ranges, start at the head and then drag downwards. Also remember that your weapon is going to function a little bit differently depending on the attachments. So if you're having a rough time with recoil, then you want to use a compensator, you want to use a forward grip, and you don't want to equip high velocity ammo. But if you really have the hang of the recoil pattern of your weapon, you can actually ditch those attachments and explore other possibilities. If this video has been interesting or helpful, please feel free to like, subscribe, and tell your friends about the channel. Thanks very much, folks. We're all signing off.